Russia is running out of routes, not metaphorically, literally. At this hour, every road, every rail line, every ferry crossing, and every supply artery feeding the Crimean Peninsula is either burning, broken, or under the gun of a Ukrainian targeting cell that knows exactly where to strike next. The Avangard, the last railway ferry Russia had in the Kerch Strait still capable of moving heavy military rolling stock, is out of action. The Slavianin, the one that limped along beside it, has been struck and struck again. The Conroe trader sits on the bottom. The Chonhar Bridge has been hit. The Heniches crossing has been hit. The land corridor through Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Melitopol is now an open shooting gallery for Ukrainian medium-range drones operating with a precision and persistence that did not exist 18 months ago. And looming above all of it, the Kerch Strait Bridge, the 18 billion ruble symbol of Vladimir Putin's annexation, the structure he personally drove a truck across in 2018 to mark his conquest, now sits exposed in a way it has never been exposed before. Let that sink in for a moment. The peninsula Moscow declared Russian forever in 2014 is, in operational terms, becoming an island. And the people who built that island do not have a plan for what comes next. This is not a story about a bridge. This is a story about the collapse of an entire logistics architecture that Russian planners spent 11 years constructing on the assumption that Ukraine would never have the reach, the technology, or the doctrinal sophistication to take it apart piece by piece. What you are witnessing is not a series of isolated strikes. It is the methodical, surgical, sequenced dismantling of the only thing keeping a Russian army group alive on occupied territory. And before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what Ukraine did, but why this outcome was always going to arrive once Russia chose to defend Crimea with assumptions instead of capability. Pull the lens back for a moment because the headlines do not capture what is actually happening here. Let me walk you through what this means at the strategic level. There are and have always been exactly 4 ways to move significant military cargo into occupied Crimea. The first is the Kerch Strait Bridge itself, the rail and road crossing from Russia's Krasnodar Krai. The second is the railway ferry service across the Kerch Strait, which Russia stood up specifically because the bridge railway was damaged in October 2022 and Moscow stopped trusting heavy military trains to use it. The third is the land corridor through southern Ukraine, the so-called land bridge running through Rostov, Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol, and into Jankoy, the central rail hub of northern Crimea. The fourth is the bridge complex over the Sivash Lagoon at Chonhar and Heniches, which connects the same land corridor down into the peninsula from the Ukrainian side. 4 arteries. That is it. There is no fifth route. There is no maritime resupply option of meaningful scale because the Russian Black Sea Fleet has already been pushed out of Sevastopol and operates from Novorossiysk now. There is no air bridge that can carry tanks, fuel, and ammunition at the scale a frontline army group consumes daily. 4 arteries, and Ukraine has now placed every single one of them under continuous, credible, doctrinally targeted threat. That is the situation Moscow is waking up to. Now rewind with me because to understand why this matters, you have to understand what Russian planners believed before the war and what they continue to believe well into 2024. The original assumption was simple and on paper defensible. Crimea was secured by geography. The Kerch Strait was a natural moat. The land corridor once captured would be defended by the depth of the occupation zone, by layered air defense, by the Black Sea Fleet, and by the simple distance from the Ukrainian rear. Ukrainian artillery could not reach it. Ukrainian aviation could not survive in it. Ukrainian missiles in 2022 did not exist in numbers or ranges sufficient to threaten it. And the Kerch Bridge itself was treated as an engineering marvel hardened against everything short of a nuclear strike, ringed with S-400 batteries, surveillance, and eventually the S-500 Prometheus, Russia's most advanced long-range air defense system, the one Moscow brags about in state media as the answer to every Western weapon. That was the Russian theory of victory in the South. Defend the moat, hold the corridor, keep the bridge open, and the peninsula stays Russian. And here's where the doctrinal failure begins, because that theory was already obsolete the day it was written. It assumed a static technological battlefield. It assumed Ukraine would remain a recipient of foreign weapons rather than a builder of indigenous ones. It assumed that drone warfare would remain a tactical novelty rather than a strategic instrument. It assumed that intelligence operations, sabotage networks, and underwater explosives would not enter the equation. It assumed, above all, that the side with the bigger industrial base would set the tempo. Every one of those assumptions has failed. And it gets even more serious from here because Russian planners did not just hold these assumptions in 2022. They kept holding them in 2023, in 2024, and into 2025, even as the evidence in front of their faces told them the theory was breaking. That is not a tactical error. That is a category-level strategic miscalculation, and we are now watching it produce its inevitable consequences. Let me walk you through the chronology because the sequencing matters. October 2022, a truck bomb detonates on the Kerch Bridge. The road deck is damaged, the rail deck is damaged, and Russia quietly stops moving heavy military rail traffic across it. That is the first crack. That is the moment Moscow privately admitted the bridge was not what it was advertised to be. July 2023, the Ukrainian security service hits the bridge again, this time with naval surface drones, collapsing a section of the road deck. The bridge is repaired, but the message is now public. The structure is reachable. Storm Shadow and Scout missiles supplied by Britain and France begin striking the Chonhar Bridge in June 2023, damaging it repeatedly. The land corridor begins to feel pressure. By 2024, the Ukrainian campaign has escalated to direct strikes on Russian railway ferries, the workaround Moscow invented after the 2022 bridge damage. The Conroe trader is hit and sunk. The Avangard is damaged. The Slavyanin is struck in July of that year. Russia is now running a logistics shell game, swapping between rail, ferry, road, and land corridor depending on which is least damaged that week. And this is the moment where mainstream coverage misses the most important variable. The Western press kept asking the wrong question. The wrong question was, when will Ukraine destroy the Kerch Bridge? The right question, the one Russian planners should have been asking themselves, was, what happens when Ukraine does not need to destroy the Kerch Bridge because it can simply neutralize everything around it? That is the doctrinal pivot. That is the hidden military variable the headlines did not capture. Ukraine did not need a single catastrophic Hollywood demolition of the Kerch span. Ukraine needed to make the bridge functionally useless by killing every supporting artery, raising the cost of every alternative route, and forcing Russia into a logistics posture where the bridge becomes a single point of failure that Moscow is terrified to actually use. And that is precisely the campaign that has now unfolded. In March of 2026, the Avangard, the workhorse railway ferry, was put out of action by a Ukrainian strike that also damaged the Slavyanin in the same operation. By April, Ukrainian military intelligence reported that the Slavyanin, the last operational railway ferry in the Kerch Strait still afloat, was also taken out. Read those two sentences again because the implication is enormous. Russia's entire workaround for its damaged bridge railway, the ferry system it stood up in 2022, specifically to move heavy military rolling stock without trusting the bridge, has been eliminated. That capacity is gone. It is not degraded. It is not reduced. It is gone. Russia now has exactly one rail option into Crimea, and it is the same rail line on the Kerch Bridge that Moscow has been afraid to load with heavy military trains since October 2022. This matters enormously because modern mechanized warfare runs on rail. Tanks, fuel, artillery shells, missile reloads, replacement vehicles, and ammunition for an army group are not moved at scale by truck convoys. They move by train, and Russia's train options into Crimea have collapsed from multiple redundant pathways down to one nervous, half-trusted span. And it gets even more serious from here because the second pillar, the land corridor through southern Ukraine, is now under the same kind of systematic pressure. Beginning in early May of 2025 and accelerating sharply through 2026, Ukrainian medium-range drones started targeting sites along the Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol, Jankoy rail axis. We are talking about repeated, deliberate strikes on rolling stock, on locomotives, on fuel depots, on rail substations, on bridges, on the very specific choke points that any logistics officer would identify on a map. In April of 2026, Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, the HUR, executed a series of operations through its Ghost unit, striking Russian military trains on the peninsula itself. Pull that lens back. Ukraine is no longer just interdicting traffic on the way into Crimea. Ukraine is hitting trains that have already arrived in Crimea. That is a different kind of war. That is a war in which the Russian rear is not a rear anymore. And the third pillar, the bridge complex over the Sivash Lagoon, the Chonhar and Henichesk crossings, has been hit so many times since 2023 that Russia has effectively given up trying to use it for heavy military traffic. Engineers patch the deck. Storm shadow strikes blow new holes. The cycle repeats. Russia has even tried to build pontoon bypasses and temporary rail spurs. Those too get hit. The result is that the southern land approach into Crimea now operates at a fraction of its theoretical capacity, with every kilogram of cargo paying a tax in delay, risk, and attrition. So we arrive at the present moment. 3 of the 4 arteries are functionally suppressed. The ferries are gone. The southern bridges are intermittently passable at best. The land corridor is a continuous shooting gallery. That leaves the Kerch Bridge itself as the last remaining artery of meaningful capacity, and this is where the strategic noose tightens to a point that should be terrifying to anyone sitting in the Kremlin tonight. The real question is not whether Ukraine can destroy the Kerch Bridge in a single spectacular strike. The real question is what happens to the Russian military position in Crimea when the Kerch Bridge is the only artery left and Russia knows, in its operational bones, that this artery is now within reach of long Neptune cruise missiles, of layered drone swarms, of underwater sabotage operations of the kind the SBU has already demonstrated, and of the kind of combined arms strike package that defense analysts at the Hudson Institute and elsewhere have been publicly mapping for 2 years. Russia's answer to this has been the S-500 Prometheus deployment. Moscow moved its sole regiment of the S-500, the system it markets as the most advanced long-range air defense platform in the world, to defend the Kerch Bridge. That should tell you everything. When you commit your single most prestigious strategic air defense asset to protect one piece of infrastructure, you are not communicating confidence. You are communicating dependence. You are telling the world that this bridge is now the central nervous system of your southern theater and that you have nothing else with which to defend it. And Ukrainian strikes have already, by multiple credible reporting, damaged components associated with that S-500 deployment. The supposedly invincible umbrella is not invincible. It is a target like any other, and it is sitting on a peninsula that is rapidly running out of road. This is the moment where doctrine matters more than hardware. Let me explain what the broader pattern is, because every piece of this fits a single coherent military logic that Russian planners failed to anticipate and Ukrainian planners executed with patience. The pattern is called systems destruction warfare. You do not need to destroy the enemy's army. You do not even need to destroy the enemy's flagship asset. You need to identify the network of dependencies that keeps that army and that asset functional, and you need to attack those dependencies in sequence, from the most replaceable to the least replaceable, so that by the time you arrive at the flagship target, the enemy is too logistically degraded, too defensively overextended, and too operationally exhausted to defend it. That is what has happened here. Ukraine has not been losing the Crimea campaign for the last 3 years. Ukraine has been winning it slowly, methodically, in a way that does not generate Western headlines, but does generate Russian panic. And the panic is now visible. It is visible in the S-500 redeployment. It is visible in the Russian fuel shortages that have spread through occupied Crimea over the last 12 months. It is visible in the reports of 60,000 Russian troops on the peninsula whose supply situation has degraded from stable to precarious. It is visible in the increasingly desperate Russian information operations claiming that the land bridge has been restored, claims that collapsed the moment Ukrainian drones hit the next train. And here is the deeper lesson, the one that mainstream coverage continues to miss. This is not about Ukraine winning a tactical engagement. This is about the structural obsolescence of a Russian theory of warfare that assumed mass geography and air defense could substitute for adaptability. Russia built its southern theater around a fortress mentality. Ukraine built its campaign around a network mentality. The fortress assumes the attacker will throw himself against the walls. The network assumes the attacker will find every door, every window, every drain, every wire running into the building, and use them in sequence until the building can no longer function. Russia is the fortress. Ukraine is the network. And in modern warfare, the network wins because modern warfare is not about who holds ground. It is about who can keep the ground supplied. Russia cannot supply Crimea reliably anymore. That is the headline beneath the headline. That is the verdict. Pull the lens back one more time, because the strategic implications run further than Crimea. If a peninsula defended by the S-500, by the Black Sea Fleet, by 11 years of fortification, by the personal political prestige of Vladimir Putin himself, can be progressively isolated by a country that in 2022 was supposedly going to fall in 72 hours, then every assumption about Russian military durability is now in question. Every Russian operational plan that depends on rear area sanctuary is now in question. Every Russian strategic narrative that says time is on Moscow's side is now in question, because time has produced this outcome. Time has produced a Ukrainian military that builds its own long-range cruise missiles, fields medium-range strike drones in industrial quantities, runs deep penetration intelligence operations on Russian-held territory, and executes campaigns of systems destruction warfare at a sophistication that Western defense ministries are now studying as case material. That is what time has done, and the Crimea campaign is the proof. What happens next changes everything, and I want to be precise about what next looks like. In the coming months, expect 3 developments. First, expect continued strikes on the Kerch Bridge itself, not necessarily aimed at the road span, but aimed at the rail span, the support pylons, the approaches, the air defense network around it, and the rail infrastructure feeding it from the Russian side. The objective is not Hollywood demolition. The objective is functional degradation. Second, expect intensified Ukrainian attacks on the Crimean rail network internal to the peninsula itself, the lines from Jankoy south to Sevastopol, Simferopol, and the southern bases. Once you cannot get supplies into Crimea, the next vulnerability is distributing what little arrives. Ukraine is already hitting that layer. Third, expect Russia to respond by escalating its own attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, because that is the only asymmetric lever Moscow has left. Watch for it. The pattern is predictable. And as all of this unfolds, the larger judgment of history is already taking shape. When future war colleges teach the Russo-Ukrainian War, the Crimea logistics campaign will be the textbook example of how a smaller, technologically adaptive military can dismantle a larger, doctrinally rigid adversary through patient systems destruction. The Kerch Bridge will not be remembered as Putin's monument. It will be remembered as the last vulnerable lifeline of an occupation that ran out of options. And the moment Russian planners decided to build their southern theater around a single bridge defended by yesterday's assumptions will be remembered as the moment the war in the south was already lost, even if it took years to become visible. The question is no longer whether Crimea can be held by Russia indefinitely. The question is how long the current Russian posture can survive once the last artery becomes a contested artery, and what Moscow does when the answer to that question arrives. Because the answer is arriving. You can see it in the empty ferry slips at Port Kavkaz. You can see it in the burned-out rail cars near Jankoy. You can see it in the S-500 batteries scrambling to cover a bridge that was supposed to be untouchable. You can see it in the silence from Russian state media when they are asked directly how the peninsula will be supplied in the spring offensive season. So stay with us, because those questions do not have simple answers, and the next month is going to clarify what the next year of this war actually looks like. If this kind of analysis is what you came here for, the kind that pulls back from the headline and shows you the doctrine underneath, then subscribe to the channel and help us reach the goal we have set for this community. We are building a place where the strategic logic of this war is explained without the noise, without the partisan filler, and without the hedging that keeps mainstream coverage from telling you what is actually happening. The next chapter of the Crimea campaign is being written right now, and you will want to be here when the next decisive moment arrives, because it is coming. And when it does, you will already understand why it was always going to.